the 1960s. An era of boundless optimism, revolutionary ideas, and technological dreams that promised to reshape American life forever. It was the decade that put a man on the moon, invented the computer mouse, and gave us the first artificial heart. America was the undisputed king of innovation, and the future looked brighter than a freshly polished Cadillac under the California sun. But here's the thing about innovation. For every brilliant idea that changes the world, there are dozens that crash and burn spectacularly. And the 1960s? Oh, they had some doozies. Today, we're diving into 12 American inventions from the 1960s that were supposed to revolutionize everything, but instead became cautionary tales of what happens when ambition meets reality. These weren't just minor missteps. These were full-blown, money-burning, reputation-destroying failures that make you wonder, what were they thinking? Buckle up. This is going to be a wild ride through the graveyard of American innovation. 1. Ford Edsel, the car that killed a name. Let's kick things off with arguably the most famous commercial failure in automotive history, the Ford Edsel. Now, technically, the Edsel launched in 1958, but it limped pathetically into 1960 before Ford finally pulled the plug. And what a spectacular failure it was. This wasn't just a car that didn't sell well. This was a billion-dollar disaster that became synonymous with corporate catastrophe. Ford had spent years developing the Edsel. They'd invested over $250 million, which in today's money would be well over $2 billion. They'd conducted extensive market research. They'd created an entirely new division within the company. They'd hyped it up like it was going to be the second coming of the automobile. And then they revealed it. The Edsel had a distinctive vertical grille that, well, let's just say people had opinions. Some compared it to a horse collar. Others said it looked like an Oldsmobile sucking a lemon. One critic memorably described it as resembling a toilet seat. The design was meant to be bold and futuristic, but instead it was just weird. But the ugly grille wasn't the real problem. The Edsel was also overpriced, poorly timed, and mechanically unreliable. The first models had so many quality control issues that early buyers felt like unpaid beta testers. Oil leaks, transmission failures, push buttons that didn't push, brakes that barely braked. The Edsel had it all. Ford had predicted they'd sell 200,000 units in the first year. They sold 64,000. By the time they discontinued the line in November 1959, they'd lost somewhere between $250 and $350 million. The name Edsel, which had been chosen to honor Henry Ford's only son, became such a symbol of failure that it entered the American lexicon as shorthand for a spectacular flop. Even today, when a product bombs catastrophically, someone will inevitably call it the next Edsel. The Edsel wasn't just a failed car. It was a masterclass in how not to launch a product, and it haunted Ford for decades. 2. Smell-o-vision, cinema that made you sick. Imagine sitting in a movie theater, completely immersed in the film, when suddenly you smell roses, or fresh-baked bread, or the ocean. Sounds kind of cool, right? That was the promise of smell-o-vision, a technology that was supposed to add an entirely new dimension to cinema. The concept was simple. During specific scenes, scents would be released into the theater through a sophisticated system of tubes and vents built into the seats. Romantic scene in a garden, rose scent, chase through a bakery, fresh bread aroma. It was meant to make movies more immersive, more real, more sensory. Smell-o-vision made its one and only theatrical debut in 1960 with a film called Scent of Mystery, produced specifically to showcase the technology. The movie was shot in Spain and featured a mystery plot that supposedly required your sense of smell to follow along. 30 different scents were deployed throughout the film. It was a disaster. First, the technology simply didn't work very well. The scents often arrived too late or lingered too long. You'd smell the roses from scene 12 during scene 15, which completely ruined the experience. Some audience members in the front of the theater would get hit with an overwhelming blast of scent, while people in the back smelled nothing at all. Second, and this is crucial, mixing dozens of different scents in an enclosed space creates a nauseating olfactory cocktail. Imagine smelling wine, then tobacco, then peaches, then gunpowder, then perfume, all within the span of 20 minutes, with each scent overlapping the last. People weren't immersed in the movie. They were fighting the urge to vomit. Third, the system was absurdly expensive to install and maintain. Theater owners would have to completely overhaul their venues, and for what? A gimmick that made audiences feel sick. The critics absolutely savaged it. Time magazine famously quipped that smell-o-vision quickly, and not surprisingly, got whiffed off the screen. The New York Times was even harsher, suggesting the only scent the audience could detect was the smell of desperation from the filmmakers. Scent of Mystery was quickly re-released as Holiday in Spain, with all the scent technology removed. Smell-o-vision was dead on arrival, one of the shortest-lived technologies in cinema history. The entire concept was shelved and never seriously attempted again, though I'll admit, given how some people behave in modern movie theaters, maybe the real smell-o-vision is just sitting near someone who didn't shower. 3. Picture phone. The Zoom. Nobody wanted. In 1964, AT&T unveiled what they believed would be the future of communication, the picture phone. This revolutionary device would allow people to see each other while talking on the phone, transforming the impersonal telephone call into a face-to-face conversation, even across vast distances. Sound familiar? That's because we basically use this technology every single day now with FaceTime, Zoom, Skype, and dozens of other video calling apps. AT&T's vision of the future was absolutely correct. Their timing, however, was spectacularly wrong. The picture phone was first demonstrated at the 1964 World's Fair in New York, where fairgoers could make video calls between special booths. The technology actually worked. You could see a small, grainy black and white image of the person you were talking to. For 1964, this was genuinely impressive stuff, like something out of the Jetsons. AT&T was so confident this was the future that they launched commercial picture phone service in 1970, initially in Pittsburgh. They predicted that by 1980, video phones would be in millions of American homes. They were incredibly, monumentally wrong. The problem wasn't the technology itself, though the image quality was poor and the units were expensive. The real problem was that people simply didn't want it, and when you think about it, their reasons made perfect sense. First, you had to get dressed and look presentable to make a phone call. One of the great joys of talking on the phone was that you could do it in your pajamas, half asleep, looking like you'd been dragged through a hedge backwards. The picture phone took that freedom away. Second, there was nowhere to hide. Phone calls were suddenly performances. You had to maintain eye contact, watch your facial expressions, and sit still. You couldn't multitask, couldn't wander around, couldn't pick your nose. Third, and this is huge, the technology required both parties to have a picture phone. Since almost nobody bought them, there was almost nobody to call. It was the classic network effect problem. The device was only valuable if lots of people had it, but people wouldn't buy it until lots of people had it. By 1973, there were only about 500 picture phone units in service nationwide. 500. AT&T had spent over $500 million developing and promoting the technology. They quietly discontinued the service in 1974. The irony is delicious. AT&T was absolutely right about video calling being the future, but they were about 40 years too early. They needed faster internet, better cameras, smaller devices, and most importantly, a global pandemic to force everyone to get comfortable with video calls. The picture phone is a perfect example of how being right about the future doesn't guarantee success in the present. 4. 8-track cartridges. the format time forgot. Let's talk about a technology that technically succeeded before failing spectacularly: the 8-track cartridge. Now, the 8-track was actually invented in 1964 and had a decent run through the late 60s and into the 70s. For a glorious moment, it was the coolest way to listen to music in your car. No more fumbling with radio dials or carefully handling vinyl records. You just slid a cartridge into your car stereo and boom, continuous music. Ford began offering 8-track players as optional equipment in their cars in 1965, and other manufacturers quickly followed. By the late 60s, you weren't cool unless you had an 8-track player in your ride, a stack of cartridges in your glove box, and that distinctive K-chunk sound as the player switched between tracks mid-song. Wait, what was that? Oh, right. The fatal flaw of the 8-track. Because of how the tape was configured in a continuous loop with 4 programs of 2 tracks each, songs often got interrupted mid-performance as the player mechanically switched between programs. You'd be listening to Hey Jude, getting really into it, and suddenly, K-chunk, silence for a few seconds. Then the song would resume. It was like a record scratch, except it happened all the time, and it was by design. But in the late 60s, this seemed like a reasonable price to pay for portable music. The format became hugely popular. Record companies released albums on 8-track. Blank 8-tracks let you record your own mixes. The technology seemed unstoppable. And then, the compact cassette arrived and crushed it like a bug under a boot. Cassettes, which had been introduced by Philips in 1963 but took a while to catch on, were smaller, cheaper to produce, had better sound quality, didn't interrupt songs randomly, and, this is crucial, you could actually fast forward and rewind them precisely. With an 8-track, if you wanted to hear a specific song, you had to let the whole thing cycle through until it came back around. With a cassette, you just hit rewind. By the late 1970s, the 8-track was already obsolete. By the early 80s, it was effectively dead. The last 8-track album released by a major label was Fleetwood Mac's Greatest Hits in 1988, and that was probably just to clear out old inventory. The 8-track had a good run, sure, but it's remembered now as a technological dead end, a format that was outdated almost as soon as it became popular. It's the answer to a trivia question, a nostalgic curiosity, the thing your dad mentions when he's telling stories about the good old days. The 8-track proved that in technology, being first doesn't mean being best, and even a successful innovation can become a relic in the blink of an eye. 5. Electric hairbrush for bald men, hope in a box. The 1960s were a golden age for miracle products that promised to solve problems with revolutionary technology, and few problems inspired more desperate hope and more shameless hucksterism than male pattern baldness. Enter the electric hairbrush for bald men, a device that promised to stimulate hair growth through the power of electricity and vibration. Because apparently, what follicles need to spring back to life is a good mechanical massage. The concept was beautifully simple. You'd run this special electric brush over your bald scalp, and the vibrations would supposedly increase blood flow to the hair follicles, somehow shocking them back into production. Some versions combined the vibrations with heat. Others incorporated various oils or tonics that you'd apply first. All of them promised the same thing, that with regular use, you'd soon be running your fingers through a thick, luxurious mane. It was, of course, complete nonsense. Male pattern baldness is caused by genetics and hormones, specifically sensitivity to dihydrotestosterone. No amount of vibrating or stimulating the scalp is going to overcome your genetic programming. You might as well try to vibrate yourself taller, but try telling that to a man watching his hairline recede. The electric hairbrush for bald men sold remarkably well throughout the 60s, propelled by desperation and heavily exaggerated advertising claims. Ads showed men with full heads of hair who had supposedly used the device, conveniently leaving out the fact that these men probably just had hair to begin with. The Federal Trade Commission eventually cracked down on the most egregious false advertising claims, but the damage was done. Thousands of men had spent good money on devices that did absolutely nothing except give them a mildly pleasant scalp massage. The electric hairbrush for bald men represents a particular kind of 60s optimism. The belief that technology could solve any problem, even biological ones governed by genetics. It was the same mindset that brought us diet pills that were basically just amphetamines and exercise machines that claimed you could get fit without moving. These devices are collector's items now, museum pieces that remind us of an era when hope triumphed over science, at least until the money ran out and the hair still didn't grow back. 6. The Aero Car, Flying Car Dreams, Grounded Reality. If you ask people to imagine the future as envisioned in the 1960s, flying cars are probably near the top of the list. And one of the most serious attempts to make that dream a reality was the Taylor Aero Car, developed by inventor Moulton Taylor. The Aero Car wasn't some pie-in-the-sky concept drawing. It was a real, functioning vehicle that could actually fly. Taylor had been working on the design since the late 1940s, and by 1956, he had a working prototype. The concept was brilliant. It was a car with detachable wings and a propeller. When you wanted to drive, you'd park at the airport, remove the wings and tail section, and drive away. When you wanted to fly, you'd reassemble everything, taxi to the runway and take off. It actually worked. The Aero Car was certified by the Civil Aeronautics Administration in 1956 and could legally be flown. As a car, it could drive on regular roads. As a plane, it could cruise at about 110 miles per hour. Taylor had seemingly solved the flying car problem. So why isn't your driveway full of aero cars? Because while the Aero Car worked in theory, it was absolutely terrible in practice. First, it was expensive. Really expensive. At a time when you could buy a nice new car for $2,000 or $3,000. An Aero Car cost around $25 US. That's over $250 in today's money. For that price, you could buy a nice car and a nice plane and still have money left over. Second, it was mediocre at both jobs. As a car, it was underpowered, cumbersome, and weird-looking. As a plane, it was slow, had limited range, and lacked the performance of dedicated aircraft. You were essentially paying a fortune for something that did two things poorly instead of one thing well. Third, and this is the killer, the transition between car mode and plane mode took about 30 minutes and required you to be at an airport. You couldn't just decide to take flight when traffic got bad. You had to drive to an airport, spend half an hour transforming your vehicle, get clearance for takeoff, fly to another airport, spend another half hour converting back to car mode, then continue driving. For most trips, it would have been faster to just drive the whole way or just fly the whole way in separate vehicles. Fourth, you needed a pilot's license. This wasn't a car that happened to fly. It was a plane that happened to drive. That meant training, certification, medical exams, and all the regulations that come with aviation. The market for people who wanted to be pilots and who wanted a car-plane hybrid and who could afford $25,000 turned out to be vanishingly small. Taylor managed to build 6 Aero Cars between 1949 and the late 1960s. 6. He needed to sell 500 to begin mass production. He never came close. The Aero Car remained a fascinating curiosity, a working prototype of a future that never arrived. The flying car dream didn't die with the Aero Car. People are still trying to make it work today. But the Aero Car proved that just because you can build something doesn't mean anyone will buy it. 7. Clairol Touch of Yogurt Shampoo. Food for your hair. The 1960s were a weird time for beauty products. Companies were experimenting with all sorts of novel ingredients and concepts, trying to stand out in an increasingly crowded market. And then Clairol, a major hair care company, had what they thought was a brilliant idea: shampoo with yogurt. Not shampoo that smelled like yogurt, actual shampoo with yogurt in it. The thinking was that yogurt contained proteins and nutrients that could nourish your hair, making it shinier and healthier. The protein in dairy products had long been touted for hair health, so why not put it directly in the shampoo? They called it Touch of Yogurt Shampoo, and they were convinced it would be a hit. It was not a hit. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone who opened a bottle. It smelled like yogurt, and not in a pleasant, "Oh, that's interesting" kind of way. It smelled like you dumped food on your head, which, to be fair, you kind of had. Consumers were deeply confused. Was this a food product? A hair product? Could you eat it? Should you refrigerate it? And most importantly, why would anyone want their hair to smell like dairy? The scent was the main issue, but there were practical problems too. The yogurt components didn't mix particularly well with the other ingredients, leading to separation and an unpleasant texture. The product had a shorter shelf life than regular shampoo because of the dairy content. And once people started using it, they realized that having hair that smelled like yogurt wasn't exactly a selling point when you were trying to attract romantic partners or make a good impression at work. The marketing tried to emphasize the nutritional aspect, the natural ingredients, the scientific benefits. But it didn't matter. People didn't want their hair to smell like food, period. Especially not food that could go sour. Touch of Yogurt shampoo was pulled from shelves relatively quickly, becoming one of Clairol's rare major flops. It's remembered now as a cautionary tale about the difference between what sounds good in a boardroom and what actually works in consumers' bathrooms. The failure taught the beauty industry an important lesson. Just because an ingredient is good for you internally doesn't mean it belongs in your hair care products. And just because something is natural doesn't mean people want to smell like it. Decades later, we can look back and laugh. But somewhere there's a Clairol executive who still has nightmares about the yogurt shampoo disaster. 8. Disposable paper clothing, fashion's biggest misfire. In 1966, the Scott Paper Company, yes, the toilet paper company, decided to revolutionize fashion with an invention that seemed brilliantly futuristic: disposable paper clothing. The concept was peak 1960s modernism. Why waste time washing clothes? Why clutter your closet with garments you'd wear again and again? Instead, imagine a world where you'd wear an outfit once, toss it in the trash, and put on something new tomorrow. It would be liberating, convenient, the very definition of modernity. Scott Paper initially created paper dresses as a promotional gimmick. You could mail in coupons and get a paper dress for $1. 25. They expected to sell a few thousand. Instead, they sold over 500. 000. Suddenly, paper clothing seemed like it might actually be the future. Other companies jumped in. Soon you could buy paper dresses, paper pants, paper shirts, even paper wedding dresses. Some were printed with wild, psychedelic patterns that perfectly captured the 60s aesthetic. Others were plain and meant to be decorated with markers or paint. Fashion magazines ran spreads featuring paper clothing. For a brief moment it seemed like fabric might be obsolete. Then reality set in. First problem: paper isn't very durable. These garments would tear at the slightest provocation. Sit down too quickly, rip, reach for something, tear, get caught on literally anything, shred. People discovered that paper clothing was essentially tissue-thin armor against the world. Some dresses wouldn't even survive being put on. Second problem: comfort. Paper doesn't breathe. It doesn't move with your body. It doesn't feel good against your skin. Wearing paper clothing, especially in warm weather, was like wrapping yourself in a slightly scratchy, completely inflexible envelope. You'd sweat, the paper would stick to you, and you'd be miserable. Third problem: environmental disaster. Yes, The paper was technically biodegradable, but the amount of waste generated by single-use clothing was staggering. People started doing the math and realized that if everyone wore disposable clothes, we'd be drowning in trash. This was before the modern environmental movement really took off, but even 1960s consumers could see the problem. Fourth problem, you couldn't wash them at all. If you spilled something on your paper dress, that was it. Game over. And since the dresses were designed to be worn once anyway, you couldn't even try to clean them. You just threw them away. By 1968, the paper clothing fad was essentially dead. It turned out that people actually liked their clothes to be durable, comfortable, washable, and not prone to spontaneous disintegration. What a concept. Paper clothing is remembered now as one of the most bizarre fashion trends of the 1960s, proof that not every modern idea is actually an improvement. The few surviving paper dresses are collector's items, museum pieces that make people wonder what everyone was thinking. The failure of paper clothing proved that convenience isn't everything, and that some traditional solutions, like fabric, exist for very good reasons. 9. Diet candy cigarettes. The worst idea ever. If you thought some of the previous entries were bad ideas, buckle up because we're about to discuss what might be the single worst product concept of the entire decade. Diet candy cigarettes. Let me explain what these were, because just the name doesn't fully capture the insanity. In the 1960s, candy cigarettes were already a thing. These were chalky white candy sticks designed to look like cigarettes, marketed to kids who wanted to imitate their smoking parents. They were controversial even then, but they were legal and widely available. Some genius entrepreneur looked at candy cigarettes and thought, you know what would make these better? If we marketed them as a diet aid for adults. The logic, such as it was, went like this. Smoking cigarettes suppresses appetite. Many women in the 1960s smoked specifically to stay thin, but smoking is unhealthy. So why not create candy cigarettes that you'd suck on whenever you felt hungry? You'd keep your hands and mouth busy, satisfy your oral fixation, get a little burst of sweetness, and avoid eating actual food. Diet achieved. There are so many layers of wrong here that it's hard to know where to start. First, they were candy. Sugary candy. The idea of using candy as a diet aid is like using gasoline to fight a fire. Sure, each candy cigarette didn't have many calories, but if you're constantly sucking on them to suppress your appetite, those calories add up fast. Second, the cigarette association was deeply problematic. At a time when doctors were just beginning to widely acknowledge the health risks of smoking, here was a product deliberately evoking cigarettes as a healthy choice. The cognitive dissonance was spectacular. Third, the whole concept promoted terrible eating habits. Instead of encouraging people to eat balanced, nutritious meals, it suggested they should just suppress their hunger with candy. That's not a diet, that's disordered eating with a marketing budget. Fourth, and this really can't be overstated, they were marketing what looked like cigarettes as a health product to achieve thinness. The entire concept was a masterclass in everything wrong with 1960s diet culture, which was already pretty toxic. The Federal Trade Commission and various health organizations came down on diet candy cigarettes like a ton of bricks. The products were pulled from shelves amid criticism from doctors, nutritionists, and anyone with a shred of common sense. Diet candy cigarettes represent the absolute nadir of 60s health fads, a perfect storm of bad science, worse marketing, and societal pressure on women to be thin at any cost. They're remembered now with a mixture of horror and disbelief, a reminder that the good old days had some spectacularly bad ideas. 10. The Vibro vacuum. Shake your way to disappointment. Picture this. You're standing in front of a machine with a wide belt. You position the belt around your waist, stomach, thighs, or whatever body part you want to slim down. You turn on the machine, and the belt begins to vibrate violently, shaking your flesh like you're a human maraca. You stand there for 10, 15, 20 minutes while your body jiggles and shakes. And supposedly, magically, you lose weight without actually exercising. Welcome to the Vibro vacuum and its many similar competitors, the passive exercise machines that promised to literally shake the fat off your body. These machines were everywhere in the 1960s. They were in gyms, in department stores, in dedicated reducing salons that catered to women desperate to lose weight without the inconvenience of actual exercise. The machines came in various forms. Some were belts that went around you. Others were platforms you'd stand on. Still others were chairs that vibrated while you sat. The marketing was aggressive and persuasive. Advertisements showed slim, attractive women using the machines, with before and after photos suggesting miraculous transformations. The copy promised that you could reduce inches from your waist, hips, and thighs without dieting or exercising. Just stand there and let the machine do the work. It was, shockingly, complete nonsense. Vibration doesn't burn fat. It doesn't tone muscles. It doesn't do anything except make you jiggle and maybe give you a strange massage. Any inches lost were temporary and due to the compression of tissue, not actual fat loss. You'd measure yourself right after using the machine, see a slight reduction, and think it was working. But an hour later, you'd be right back where you started. The only real effect these machines had was potentially negative. They could cause bruising, back problems, and circulation issues if used too vigorously or for too long. People who used them regularly sometimes developed skin irritation or worse. But the promise was so seductive, lose weight without effort, that people kept using them and kept paying for them. Reducing salons charged membership fees. Home versions of the machines sold for hundreds of dollars. It was a multi-million-dollar industry built entirely on false hope and pseudoscience. By the 1970s, fitness science had advanced enough that most people understood these machines were useless. Health clubs and gyms phased them out in favor of actual exercise equipment. The FDA and FTC cracked down on the most egregious advertising claims. Today, vibrating belt machines are museum pieces and punchlines, symbols of an era when people desperately wanted to believe in effortless weight loss. They're what we point to when we want to illustrate how far fitness science has come. Though, if we're being honest, the modern diet and fitness industry still sells plenty of effortless solutions that don't work. We've gotten more sophisticated about it, but the fundamental human desire to achieve results without effort remains unchanged. The Vibro vacuum just happened to be a more obvious scam than most. Functioned, with no support systems, no medical care, contaminated resources, and potentially hostile neighbors who didn't have shelters and now wanted yours. The shelters also raised uncomfortable moral questions. If you had a shelter and your neighbors didn't, would you let them in? If you did, would your supplies last? If you didn't, could you live with yourself? Some families actually installed armed defenses for their shelters, planning to repel neighbors by force if necessary. It was a dark glimpse into how quickly civilization might break down under pressure. More fundamentally, the shelters gave people a false sense of security. They made nuclear war seem survivable, even manageable. Just buy a shelter, stock it up, and you'd be fine. This was, of course, not true. Nuclear war would be catastrophic on a scale these backyard bunkers couldn't possibly address. By the late 1960s, as the immediate fear of imminent nuclear war faded, the fallout shelter craze died down. People realized that the shelters were expensive, uncomfortable, often useless, and ultimately just preying on their fears. Many were abandoned, filled in, or converted to wine cellars and storage rooms. Today, these Cold War relics are fascinating historical artifacts. Some people still maintain them as quirky additions to their properties, but mostly they serve as reminders of a very particular kind of fear and the industry that grew up around it. The home fallout shelter represents the dark side of 1960s optimism. The belief that even nuclear annihilation could be solved with the right consumer product. It was American ingenuity turned towards surviving the worst-case scenario, and it ultimately couldn't deliver on its promise because some scenarios are simply unsurvivable. Conclusion. Visual. Montage of all the failed inventions, transitioning to modern technology. Narrator. So there you have it. 12 American inventions from the 1960s that promised to change the world, but instead became cautionary tales, punchlines, and museum exhibits. The Ford Edsel that killed a name. The smell-o-vision that made people sick. The picture phone nobody wanted. The 8-track that couldn't compete. The electric hairbrush that couldn't grow hair. The aero car that couldn't find customers. The yogurt shampoo that smelled like food. The paper clothing that fell apart. The diet cigarettes that were candy. The vibrating belt that didn't work. The wired remote that defeated its purpose. And the fallout shelters that sold fear. These failures teach us important lessons. They remind us that innovation alone isn't enough. You need the right timing, the right market, and a product that actually solves a problem people have. They show us that being first doesn't guarantee success. They prove that clever marketing can't save a fundamentally flawed idea. And they demonstrate that just because you can build something doesn't mean anyone will buy it. But here's the interesting thing. The 1960s also gave us countless inventions that did succeed. The same decade that brought us smell-o-vision also gave us the computer mouse, LEDs, the first video games, ATMs, and audio cassettes that would eventually kill the 8-track. The same era that produced paper dresses also produced permanent press fabrics that actually improved people's lives. The difference between success and failure often came down to understanding what people actually needed versus what inventors thought they needed. The picture phone failed in the 1960s because the technology wasn't ready and people weren't interested. Video calling succeeded 50 years later because the technology matured, the price dropped, and a pandemic forced everyone to adapt. Innovation is messy. It's full of failures, false starts, and ideas that seemed brilliant in the boardroom but flopped in the real world. For every iPhone, there's a dozen forgotten gadgets that never made it out of the prototype phase. For every invention that changes society, there are hundreds that end up as answers to trivia questions. The inventors and companies behind these failed products weren't stupid. They were taking risks, trying new things, pushing boundaries. Some got unlucky with timing. Some misread the market. Some simply backed the wrong technology. But at least they tried, and in trying, they contributed to the evolutionary process of innovation. So the next time you're tempted to mock these failures, remember, today's cutting-edge technology might be tomorrow's museum curiosity. That sleek gadget you just bought might end up on a failed inventions list 50 years from now. Innovation requires the freedom to fail, and these 1960s inventors failed spectacularly. And hey, at least they gave us some great stories. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this trip through the graveyard of 1960s innovation, give this video a like, subscribe for more fascinating failures from history, and let me know in the comments. Which of these doomed inventions surprised you the most? And what